Welcome back to my channel. I have a special treat for you today. I'm Suzanne Clegg. I'm here talking about healing with Dr. Kamau Kokayi. He's a Ivy League trained physician who's now into working with consciousness, and I'm excited to have a conversation with him. So, Dr. Kokayi, why don't you tell our audience a little bit about yourself, your background, and especially why a full-fledged physician is now kind of mostly interested in energy work instead of drugs and I don't know, all that other stuff.
Sure. Well, I came out of a middle-class background in Long Island. I was a kid that was bussed in to the school. I was one of the few black students there. I had to make a serious adjustment. This is Long Island back in the 70s. Um, so that was an interesting experience. And this was a time when affirmative action was happening. So I do, in some measure, attribute this is one of the reasons I ended up in an Ivy League school. Um, and I found myself at Cornell, which was an awakening for me because we had what was called an Africana Studies and Research Center. And I think my first semester, I got like an A+ in chemistry, and they decided to make me a college scholar, which means that I didn't have to declare a major. So I could kind of freely roam and create my own program. I had a Nobel Prize laureate as an advisor, and I had a second advisor who was a Black psychologist who kind of helped me navigate different waters there at Cornell. I ended up taking enough classes to get into medical school and law school. And my real love at that time was journalism. I actually started a Black newspaper on campus called 𝗹𝗲𝗀𝗶𝗶𝗶, which means Unity Now. And my parents weren't having it in terms of me being a journalist. And it's not like I felt that strongly about anything at the time. It was just the experience of being in college, a kind of awakening on so many levels. So when it came time to figure out what am I going to do when I leave, I applied to a lot of different programs. I had a full scholarship to law school. And then I got into Yale and Harvard medical schools. And believe it or not, I still felt totally lost. That summer after school, I found myself on a trip in Africa. And I remember Harvard took away uh, my invitation because they said I hadn't responded. And then Yale called my mother, who insisted that I was coming. So you can see how out of it I was and not even responding to folks, right? So I ended up in medical school. And after about 6 weeks, I came home and I told my parents that I wasn't going back. And that was kind of an explosion in my house. I just wasn't committed. And my father saw me as this radical. Mind you, my father was actually a general, or he retired as a general in the Army. He was head of the entire New York State Guard, right? And my mother, God bless her soul, was this school teacher who she was gay or maybe bisexual. And I say that because there's a certain kind of energetic that goes with that in terms of what she was able to share with me. But anyway, I decided to go back to school, right? And in going back to school, I really I had to find my way in terms of what am I going to do? The deal I made with my parents is, look, I'll pass part one of my boards in my third year, and then I'm going to take a year off. And my goal was to go to Okinawa to study martial arts, which was my big, vocation in college. So while I was in school, a few things happened. One, I had a pretty good memory at the time, if you can imagine, given the schools I got into, and a lot of it was about memory. And as one of my advisors said, medicine is a glorified mechanic, right? And that statement stuck with me. But I started reading 𝗘𝗲𝗀𝗆 Castaneda. And 𝗘𝗲𝗀 Castaneda was someone that was schooled by this Yaqui Indian Don Juan, who was a shaman. And the stories in some of the books just totally mesmerized me, fascinated me, because they talked about a different reality that clearly wasn't the one that we're living in every day. But it's just something that seemed very interesting, more interesting than dealing with the racial slights and taunts in medical school and just regurgitating information. And I got totally involved with that. And then a couple of other things happened. One day I was making rounds, and I went to the bedside of one patient, and he said, "I'm going to die today." Right? I looked at him, I just reassured him. He was recovering from a heart attack that he had had, I think within the week. But I went off and I grabbed a resident and said, "Hey, this guy, he's really uncomfortable, feels he's going to die or whatever." And he checked him out. I said, "Everything is fine." So I go off, and later in the afternoon, I come back, I come to his bedside, and I sit down and I look at him, and he's just like a foot or two from me. He looks at me and he says, "I'm going, gone." And literally he left. And from there is all the cacophony of noise is a code, and everybody runs in the room. And I'm kind of freaked out, like, okay, where did he go? you know, where did he go? And it gave me, that was like a real turning point. And, I began to link other experiences that I had. I remember in high school, the paper of record there in Long Island was Newsday, right? And it was this article of this gentleman who was found dead in his meditation posture. And the article read that he had gone off astral planing or astral projection, and he just didn't come back to his body, right? Now, I remember that, but that memory didn't come back until I had had this experience in medical school. And then as I dove into that some more, one day I said, "You know what? I need to know if this other reality of whatever is going on here, if this is real or not. I want my clocks to stop tonight." I want to be clear that there's something other than the paradigm that's being laid out for me in medical school. I want my clocks to stop. And guess what? They freaking did. When I woke up in the middle of the night, the two clocks that I had, right, they just stopped. They just stopped swearing. I didn't remember the time, but I'm like, holy shit, these suckers stopped. So anyway, mind you, so I take this year off, but instead of going to Okinawa to study martial arts, I moved to Harlem. And I stayed in Harlem for a year where I studied metaphysics. I got involved with African culture. I began to study Chinese medicine and homeopathy, right? And I created a whole mindset that really began to incorporate these as a way then to understand illness, right? A way to understand how to help people. So I went back to medical school to finish, right? They had threatened that I couldn't get involved with any political activities and stuff. I had to be a good student, even though I wasn't a student. But once I was back, I had to write a thesis in medical school, and I wrote it on physics and medicine. And I looked at acupuncture, which at that time it was still really fuzzy. Well, how does acupuncture work? I mean, how could it possibly work? You know, because there wasn't a chemical formula for it. And I ended up looking at the work of Dr. Robert Becker, who wrote a book called The Body Electric. He was an orthopedic surgeon, either at Syracuse or Rochester, whatever. But he looked at the role of electromagnetic fields with respect to healing bones, but also with acupuncture as well. And then I uncovered studies showing that acupuncture points are points of least resistance on the body surface. So they exist, but they exist at another level of energy matter organization. And while I was away and writing my thesis, this is where applications and understanding about quantum physics began to surface, like books like The Tao of Physics by 𝗥𝗲𝗀𝗆𝗏 𝗔𝗏, The Dancing Wu-Li Masters. I'm blocking on the author. But I'm like, holy crap, these books are saying that consciousness is actually the only game in town. And what I mean by that is that they were suggesting that consciousness itself is a construct in which everything else is actually a part of, or everything actually flows from that. And that, I mean, there's just so many ways to read that relative to the role that consciousness plays in the world. And then you look at famous quantum physics experiments like the double slit experiment, where they show that the observer actually has the power to control whether something stays in an energetic state or moves into a more material or particular state. And I've gone over that experiment like dozens of times. And so I have my own take on that, which I'm actually going to be sharing it at a webinar I'm doing in January. But so we're armed with several things now. One, I have a cultural framework because I end up training in this traditional African spiritual society, and actually was a graduate priest, right? So I have that happening in the background. I have my studies in homeopathy and Chinese medicine, which ultimately led me to be on the state board for Chinese medicine for acupuncture for a number of years. I'm a past president of the State Homeopathic Medical Society. But all of this is in the background as I'm taking care of people. I've had a fee-for-service practice for well over 30 years, right? And I've integrated these things. I think one of the biggest things for me as a practitioner was applied kinesiology. I had this client, actually, I can say 𝗹𝗲𝗶𝗆 was one of my clients, and she had a chiropractor named Linda Lee. And Linda Lee did kinesiology using what are called hand modes, just different positions of the fingers in the hand that represent different energetic states or relationships to things that she would just question you about. And she had realized, come to understand some pretty amazing things about Roberta's health and what, and what she could do about it. And I became fascinated. I was getting tired of the homeopathic conferences, which was, you felt like you had to be a genius to master homeopathy. It was just so, it was so subjective relative to everyone's system and the way they look at things. So I found myself at the American College of Environmental Medicine. And I'm studying with a famous researcher at the time, a Dr. 𝗘𝗲𝗿𝗆. And we're talking about toxicity. And at the end of the conference, or her talk, we kind of go up and, you know, you surround the professor, you want to get in some last minute questions. So she does her version of kinesiology. She has somebody hold a piece of carpet, and she shows how when they hold the carpet, a strong muscle would go weak. I'm like, holy crap. You know, how is that happening? Right? And she demonstrated that. And at that point, I became sold that this is something I need to study because it's very hands-on. And this started a period where I started training with chiropractors. It's like, you can look at it, I'm like following the crumbs, so to speak. So this is the crumb that gets presented that I'm aware of, that I'm taking in. It's like, you need to learn this. You need to understand how you can connect with the body in what I'm calling now the body's indwelling intelligence by seeing how the body responds to different stimuli. And then kinesiology as a field itself, it went from looking at the relationship of spinal reflexes to muscles and muscle strength, right? And then it looked at spinal reflexes with respect to different things that you might put on your mouth, right? In terms of different things that might act as allergens or triggers. And then it was, you can just hold them. And holding that can change it. And then what happened to me, this is interesting. A lot of times you're testing, I had all these vials now. I could muscle test different things. And the point of that is that it would help your therapeutic accuracy, right? Because it would show you what a person was responding to, what they were reacting to, right? This is where we get into the woo-woo, right? I don't know how else to say it, but so what happened is that there were times where I would think I'm testing something, and the person had a different vial in their hand. So what I was saying I was testing was not the vial they had in their hand. And I said, oh, I made a mistake. But I noticed, and this might have happened over like a couple of years, that the person was actually responding to what I was thinking and not what was in the hand. So at one point that hit me like a ton of bricks that, oh shoot, they're actually responding to my thoughts relative to testing the body in different muscle groups. And I was honestly, I was blown away by that. But I began to practice that. I began to practice using my mind to interface with the body's energetic field. And, you know, it got to the point where I felt really comfortable in doing that. And what I would be testing is like, let's say a lung point showed up weak. I might have 4 or 5 things that I could use to help with the person's lung, or whatever I associated with the lung function. It might have been immunity, it might have been a particular emotion like grief, loss, disappointment, which in Chinese medicine can relate to that area of the body. So I would say I would test the idea of whether something would actually help. And at a certain point, I said, why don't you just see if just give them the frequency, the energy that they need, as opposed to just giving a particular substance. I said, well, let me just do it this way. And I tried that, and basically it didn't work. It didn't work because it might have changed the reflex in the moment, but it didn't hold. So I said, okay, I have to refine the system now. I'm sharing this whole.
So you're saying that the substances that you used were like placeholders that would anchor a vibration for your patients?
Right. There are things that were corrective for that person. So
Mhm.
then what I said to myself, I need something that I can then infuse the energy. I can put energy into that, the frequency into that, so that they hold that, then that will maintain the treatment.
This makes sense to me because I think the placebo effect has a lot more to do with resonance than with belief.
Yes. So what happened is that I decided to use rose quartz because rose quartz is associated with the heart chakra and it's associated with unconditional love. So in my mind, that would be the frequency that ultimately can hold all these other healing energies, right? So so what happened, I had one patient. I started experimenting. I was just giving people, take this home or hold this, right? I would correct the point and I would say, hold the rose quartz, right? And the idea is now that the rose quartz would carry the frequency. I would hold it and I would give it to the client. So I had one patient that had some form of colitis, and it literally would take him 3 hours to get out the house in the morning. So I prescribed a couple things for him, but I gave him the rose quartz, which, I saw the points that were weak and I programmed the frequencies in the rose quartz. Now, I am totally talking off the chart here. This is so far removed, from any of my training in allopathic medicine. But I gave it to him and he came back 3 weeks later and he says it only takes me a half hour to get out the house now.
Mm.
So I said, well, what do you do? He says, I hold the rose quartz. And it would correct his energy. So I was blown away because I was waiting, I was just checking with clients so I could get something that was clear and definitive because obviously I'm going to still give you other therapeutic things. I'm not relying on that, right? But in this case, he had helped to sort it out himself in terms of what was really helping him. And then I found over time, people would come back to get their rose quartz recharged, you know. So I continued to work with that. And
And
the
you would
whole,
recharge it? You would do something
I
in
would
your
just,
consciousness
I
while you
would,
were holding it?
right. I
Mm-hmm.
would see what was going on and I'd recharge it, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So what happened is that I realized that when I was a priest in traditional African spiritual system, I was in a particular clan, and once or twice a year, we would be responsible for the full moon ritual. And I mean, I did full moon rituals for like 16 years in ceremony and ritual, right? And you would go into this trance or altered state of consciousness, right? Because you would carry the energy, the persona, or whatever it is that wanted to express itself. So um, I said to myself, as I was doing this work, I'm saying, okay, this is clearly something that I want to explore more. And I felt the best way to do that was through meditation, right? And I was in I shared the office with a longtime friend from back in pre-med days. And I went through different iterations of my practice from having a practice with as many as 14 people to running a med spa, overseeing a study around treating people from 9/11, people that worked on the pile and that were sick, and using integrative medicine. But I decided my kids were growing and I was in Manhattan. I said I needed to be closer to home in Brooklyn, and he had an office there. So I shared space with him. And his mother did paintings. He just had beautiful paintings around the office, right? And I was trying to, I said, I wonder if I can run a meditation out of the office here, because the waiting room was big enough. And I remember one day I walked out in the waiting room and I thought about maybe I should work at this spot. And I looked up and it was a big picture of a rose, right? It was a rose was right there in the picture. So I said, oh, shoot. And then when I started examining the paintings, I realized how many paintings had roses in them, that she had done. So needless to say, I started doing, meditation sessions, and and then it came time I decided I wanted to move to California. This is my wife still beats me up about this, but I wanted to experience the West Coast. I had a friend who I came up with in high school, um, who went to Harvard, and he got involved with the defense industry and doing all kind of just inventions. He was in the Smithsonian Institute, and we I went to his birthday party. It was his 60th birthday party, and I'm out in California, and I met this other. I had run a stem cell clinic in Manhattan for a few years at this other facility, and every time I was setting up something, the company that was setting up the technology around the stem cells was being shut down by the FDA. So that happened twice, and I was unfortunate. But this other doctor, and he's still doing this, I'm not even gonna say his name, but he had his own stem cell procedure and stuff. And I walked into his office and I see a famous actor that's there. There's a bishop that's there from some other country or an important religious figure. And I'm like, let's say the guy's name is John. I'm like, John, what this is a laboratory. What do you have going on here and stuff? So between that and just the vibe of Southern California, I said, we are moving. So we move out to California, and guess what? It's just before the pandemic. So the pandemic sets in, which was actually a blessing because my New York patients were very up for telemed. So I was going back and forth between New York and California for about 7 years, right? I did that. Um, and I got to expose to the energy and culture in California, met very interesting people, but ultimately my my wife said, you know what? We need to have a home. And whatever you're doing here, it hasn't caught hold enough for you to really be financially successful in that way, right? So I end up what's the word? I end up selling interest in my New York practice. So there's another doctor that took over that. And with that money, I was able to buy a home in Charlotte, North Carolina, and come back to the East Coast. But so within this and going through the pandemic, and just you had to take some time to think about that. And obviously I had a different take on it. And I did a webinar. It's actually free on YouTube. If you look up, it's called From Mushroom Clouds to Microbes, right? And it basically looked at, okay, mankind has another way to kill itself or to kill off other people or whoever you feel is outside of you, right, that needs to be destroyed. So now, instead of the nuclear bombs, we have microbes, right? And I,
Mushrooms to microbes, yeah.
right, but it's all being used. So the point is, man is always behind creating whatever technologies that have been used to assert whatever particular group that is over another group. And out of that, I realized that there's a real crisis in consciousness. And when I say crisis in consciousness, I mean that folks have not evolved enough to a heart opening level where they can experience that the truth of our existence is really love, right? The truth of our existence is that we are just flow through vessels for consciousness to experience itself, right? And, the trick is most of us come here and we're still operating in this limited 3D bubble where the part of what is that's all around us that's real for us is what our five senses can pick up in terms of those electromagnetic signals that come in, and we say this is touch, this is taste, this is sound, and it sets it up that way. But there is a much the part that we don't connect to is consciousness itself. Now, we'll have names for it in terms of whatever culture you're in, whatever religion, right? But then that ends up gets reinterpreted through the eyes of man relative to, it usually is about securing your power or your persuasion over other people. And
Almost instantaneous. You just go to that place and suddenly you got labels for everything and it stops.
right, right. As opposed to, wait a second, this is source energy. And at a certain level, we're all connected because consciousness does not arise when that zygote is formed at conception and stuff. I've had so many women tell me that they knew the instant of conception because they actually could feel the life energy go into them. I'm
I
like,
did that with I felt it. I know
right.
exactly where I was standing when it happened.
So literally, we're talking about that there's consciousness, and then somehow we cut ourselves off from this higher awareness. And at different points, according to our brain wiring, we might exhibit special gifts or not, depending on the cultural framework and what's happening. So, in looking at, and I think I heard this phrase the first time through a Reverend Michael Beckwith at Agape in Los Angeles. The phrase is a consciousness deficit disorder. So I'm giving a clinical diagnosis to what humanity is suffering from, right? And the suffering comes from not having enough of the awareness. It goes back in that double slit experiment. There's what's demonstrated is that the observer actually determines whether something stays as an energetic medium or if it then collapses into physicality. And when you really get that, and that's just not at the subatomic level, well, now we start talking about how consciousness and belief actually impacts physiology, impacts any number of things, all the way going up to what's called the placebo effect, right? And it's the very thing that Western science tries to eliminate in all these randomized double-blind clinical experiments because they don't want to show how consciousness actually impacts what's going on. So for me, the medical system is topsy-turvy because in the West, you have to focus on just material things in terms of matter, classical physics, and everything that goes with that. In the East, you have all the emphasis on chi and energy right? That's why I was so attracted to martial arts and just seeing what you can do energetically. But in Africa, and this is where at one point I actually I was funded by some really wealthy people to travel in Africa because like I'm like, well, what were African people doing in terms of healing? What is their main ethos in terms of approaching this? And because I had already been exposed to the aspects from a cultural standpoint of going into trance and ritual, and when I end up traveling in Africa, and then even being hired at one point by United Methodist Church to understand why do Africans go to their traditional healers and not come to our clinics, I began to see that their focus was on the relationship to consciousness itself, was all about subtle energy and how to work with that for good or for bad, just like everybody else, in terms of how it gets used then, with other people, which, I'm not even going to go there.
Don't go there.
So I'm like, okay, so consciousness, that connection to consciousness, that we all have that, but in these cultures, and cultures are really rooted in nature, like in South America, whatever. Now we talk about shamanic medicine. So the witch doctor is really a shaman, but a witch doctor to denigrate the whole culture, which made it more ripe for exploitation and everything else that's happened there. But the consciousness piece, um, that that is really the key, because that's what humanity is missing, a way to elevate consciousness so that your awareness, you become more aware of things beyond your own personal needs and reality. And most human beings at this point are being ground down into a survival thinking. And between that and being exploited, right? What happens is the consciousness of the exploited is one that's rooted in fear and not enoughness, right? And that, so you see people wake up from that, whether it's a women's rights movement, whether it's, people of African descent, like I am more than the label that you want to put on me, you know. And so humanity in different ways tries to escape the bubble, the labels, the false identities and energetic frameworks that we're all in. But the real liberation or freedom is going to come from people's consciousness being elevated. This is now you get into the
So
more
let me
philosophical.
interrupt you a little bit, because isn't that a little, I'm going to play devil's advocate because I can just hear my audience thinking. Okay.
Right.
Isn't that a little bit like blaming the victim? So like if I come to you and I have these lung problems, the last thing I want to be told is that my consciousness is limited, that I haven't processed my guilt and my grief. And, it's like not helpful,
So
you
that's
know?
not, so I hear what you're saying, but
Mm-hmm.
this just becomes part of a diagnostic framework.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a blame. If you like run down the street and fall, you trip and you bruise up your knee, like nobody's really going to blame you for that. So
Mm-hmm.
it's a no blame situation, but it's still a situation.
Still
You know,
situation. Mm-hmm.
it's still something that needs to be shifted in
Mm-hmm.
order for you to truly heal. Now, this is where it gets interesting because a person might fully awaken to a higher reality or understanding about themselves, but their body is still, dysfunction.
Get the message.
Right? They
You
still
hear
got
that?
they got diabetes, they got hypertension, they got all of this, right? But then treatment then is a bit different, right? Because now it's not just the consciousness piece that we understand, but we understand the whole bioenergetic nature. Remember, I was telling you I did my thesis on physics and medicine. So there are other kind of energies, frequencies that can actually help people to heal. So this is where the idea for the multidimensional healing collective comes in,
Oh, yes.
because
That, yeah.
it's almost like if somebody decides to walk into the framework that we're creating, we have to have an understanding of how are you stuck?
Okay,
Like,
wait a minute. Let me orient the listeners.
okay,
You are right now in the process of creating a new type of medical intervention group that uses all, like, it's like a culmination of all these different paradigms that you've culmination and integration of so many of these different paradigms, and you're actually pulling it off, which is pretty cool. So
well,
people come to you and they're going to get, or come to this
well,
MDHC, and they're going to get a very different type of medicine.
so I don't even want to call it medicine, and it's more for
Okay.
legal reasons than anything else, because
Therapy.
uh, well, this falls more into the coaching, right?
Okay.
Because you know, they haven't yet created rules for how do you connect to source energy. There's no patent. You know
Yeah,
what I
yeah,
mean, right? It's like
yeah.
it can get very territorial.
Yes.
But what we're really trying to do is create more alignment between the physical and mental, emotional, mental, and spiritual self. Because the more that we can create alignment, and alignment means that, yes, you have biochemical issues. Yes, you have trauma. You have emotional issues. But we got to remember in this larger framework, right? Everything is about energy. So everything is about how do we remove these crystallized states that are affecting your body? How do we create a vessel that has more of the original flow through you can call it God consciousness, whatever you want to call it, Christ consciousness. I mean, it doesn't matter, because as human beings, we come into culture, so naturally we assign things different names. So whatever name you want to call the larger source field that we all find ourselves in. But how do you connect so that you can move beyond your five sensory apparatus and tap into the larger field and experience the connection that we all have with each other in nature, so that we're not out here just trying to kill each other, right? So that can involve now nutrition, of course. I mean, look at the garbage that we eat. They load us with, what's it, GLP-1 agonists, things that are going to increase it. And then years later, after everybody's obese and diabetic, we have the answer now. We're going to block this chemical that we have with our high fructose corn syrup and everything that we have augmented it. It goes on and on. And
Yeah.
then that will create another problem. Let's talk about the vaccine, the pandemic that we just went through. I mean, what kind of problem has that created for any number of individuals and stuff? So, you know, the technology, it doesn't matter. It's the intention. It's the intention behind it. And if the intention really comes from a heart-centered place that's connected to source, there's certain things that you're just not going to create. You're not going to put out there, because we haven't earned the right to actually function at have certain technologies that allow us to do certain things, which
Don't you
is,
think that mechanics, the doctors who are like, they drinking the Kool-Aid, they truly believe in allopathic medicine. They're heart-centered, right? As they give their, what I consider deadly prescriptions, but they do it with a lot of heart-centeredness and a lot of internal
I
alignment.
know, I mean, they consider it's miraculous, right? It's miraculous. You were obese and diabetic, and now look at you. You're healed. I mean, yes, if we were all like, if we were all, I don't want to put it on this level, but if I was a veterinarian, right, I could totally understand treating people in this way. But the spirit of man is something different, right? I mean, it's different and it's the same. It's different in that our level of self-awareness, our ability to connect, we can do better than what we're doing. I mean, look what we're doing to each other. Look what we're doing to the planet, the species that are going out, right? The quote unquote tipping point relative to the environment. And it kills me. I'm looking at a study the other day. People that live in poverty, they have a greater chance of having this illness and that illness. I mean, why are you even doing a study on that? It's like we
Common sense.
understand that, right? Do a study on how do you get humanity to change, to shift, so that we don't create these environments that are a seeding ground for violence, for poverty, and everything else. That's what's needed, but that cannot happen until there's a shift in consciousness. And it has to be enough people, it has to touch folks that are in the seats of power, right? It has to. I remember years ago, I started a not-for-profit called the Global Healing Network. And the idea was to create such a vibrational influence around the world that it would, you know, the hate and discord would have to give way to the vibration of love. It would have to shift. So now it's much easier to do this within a framework of working with individuals that have the same dedication. All of us are still dealing with everyday realities of having to put food on the table and do other things, but the times that we live in really require some more superhuman effort. You know, even if you are damaged or affected by living in this matrix, you have to figure out a way, and that way is not to just function within it. Like in the multidimensional healing collective, I tell folks, look, let's drop the titles. I'm Kamau. This is not Dr. Kokayi. Why? Because what we're tapping into has nothing to do with what I have learned or my degree. We're talking about source energy. We're talking about the same energy. And I'll give you a good example that I use. There's this movie out based on what happened to this teenager, I believe in San Diego. It's called A Miracle in Manchester, where this young teenager had a brain tumor, right? And everybody, his high school came out, everybody had read. There's an awesome picture of it where you see he's on the bleachers and he's surrounded by several hundred people. They all have read and they're extending their hand to him, right? Because he has an aggressive brain tumor and he's not doing it. You know, that tumor shrunk in like 5 days and he's around like it's years later. So it's a miracle. It's a miracle. No, let's
No,
dissect.
there's a way to
No,
do it.
there's a way to do it. Wait,
Yeah.
the fact that everybody had read on, there's a whole vibration and everyone's intention was lined up. And these are experiments that have been done. I'm trying to remember the doctor's name, but there any number. There's Lynn McTaggart intention experiments around the world, just showing how consciousness can even affect changes of things that have happened previously. I won't go there. That's a long story, but
Mm.
the whole point is that we are not using our God-given tools. We're not tapping into our own divine natures to create change that we want to see, both on the individual level and in general. There, with all the technology and stuff that we know, there's no way that people should be living in poverty right now. There's no way,
Yeah.
you know? So this is something that we are choosing to do, and we're choosing it within the context of operating from our individual personas and what's going to be best for whatever group that we identify with, right? So, I mean, this is this is a situation. Dimensional Healing Collective is bringing together individuals that are able to do a little bit more than just operate within their five senses, right? And really taking people through an experience to help them move the bar, whether it's a physical ailment that they have or just a perceptual one that's limiting them in their life in terms of making good decisions or how they can connect with people. Just changing your own internal vibration, frequency, and resonance is going to affect then what you're met with in your environment.
Yeah. So one of the ways you influenced me a million years ago is you talked about how African, I guess that shamans, I don't know if that's the right word, but people with cancer would get like round the clock healings. Like one person would
Oh,
get tired and another person would come in, or you might have 3 or 4 healers on the same
right.
person and go around the clock, around the clock. Because early in my cancer healing days, I felt like I could get the tumors to cool down. I could get them that, but I needed to rest. And I couldn't do it round the clock. I couldn't even do it 4 times a day for more than a couple days.
Right.
I needed a collective. I needed more people. So then
Right.
I said, this isn't that hard to do. This is a God, this is like, and it's part of us. Let me teach families how to do that. So a lot of my work over the last decades has been because of um, you're just like opening my eyes, probably in just an offhand comment of what they were doing
Right.
in Africa. And I go, that's it. That's the solution. And so I've done all this with a lot of lay people, right? People that have like 10 minutes of training, come on in and do it. And with varying degrees of success. And what's interesting about the multidisciplinary healing
Multi-dimensional
dimensional
healing collective.
ah
Right.
yeah sorry multidimensional healing collective is that it's a whole bunch of trained healers, or and it's like it's a motley crew. It's like different people. It doesn't really matter as long as you're coming with the intention to help, and you've got enough experience under your belt that you self-identify as a healer. um,
Mm.
I'm interested in that because that feels
Right.
like when you're putting out, I'm healing, I'm healing, I'm healing, if you're a complete newbie to that, you got a lot of resistance to that because you don't really know. There's a lot of like disbelief that gets in the way.
Right.
It's really hard to be open-minded. You say, yeah, I'm giving it a try, but there's a lot of like negativity there. But you get a bunch of healers that like, it's another day at the office, a cancer cure. Um, I think it's a smoother ride for the participant, for the healee, for the patient, for the
Well,
person who's we're trying to help. So I'm excited to participate with that and looking forward to, because I feel like one really good treatment is worth like 100 bad treatments. And I think
well,
that
this
you've got
is
the structure for that.
yeah. So, and this is why I asked you to come join our motley crew, is because I recognize your sincerity in this work. And I also recognize how difficult it is for people to focus and function in their own little separate spaces, right?
Yeah, yeah.
It's a lot involved with that. And the other thing is to really form community, right? Because this was something that was done in community. So part of my training, I work with 𝗹𝗲𝗍𝗶𝗆. And 𝗹𝗲𝗍𝗶𝗆 was a shaman from Burkina Faso who had been captured, not captured, he was abducted by missionaries when he was just a child and had been taken away. And he was found, and somehow he escaped as a teenager, right? And he came back to his village, and they had to take him through an initiation that could have killed him to reintegrate him into the spirit of their culture. And his name, they decided that he was going to go back out. And his name means one that makes friends with the enemy. And he actually set up African type villages in Europe, in New York and California that had that whole cultural energy behind it. And in training, and I did training with him, right? And I guess there are several things. One is the power of how do I explain it? It's the power of the community piece of folks actually working together in terms of helping with the healing or tapping into a particular energy, let's say. So you might tap into an earth energy, right? Beginning to look at the metaphysical aspect of different elements and how do you tap into that and actually use that in terms of healing. I've been exposed to any number of divination systems, from the I Ching to something called 𝗘𝗲𝗃 to tarot cards, but then the divination system he used, I found really fascinating in terms of, because it's something you can add to. It's something that you can now represent in your reality in terms of adding pieces and creating. I remember when I was traveling in South Africa, I went to this woman who, in there you specialize first, and then as your skills increase, it broadens, right? So she was just focused on urology, right? And she says, I have to do my floor x-ray. And her floor x-ray was she would throw the bones and figure out what was going on with you. Um, so in being exposed to different energetic healing systems, I'll share one other story. I was in Zimbabwe and I was meeting with the head of their traditional healing society. And at the time, I was scheduled to go back to the US in a few days, but my knee from an old injury was just totally blown up and swollen. I couldn't imagine being in the plane, right? So he they said he consulted, he says, we have something for you, right? So they put me in a cab and they took me out into the country somewhere. And there was this older woman who only had one eye that was functional. And it was a little shack or whatever. It was one of these corrugated huts that you see in these countries, right? And she pulled out a clean, she did whatever divination she needed to do, but I was pretty sure they already knew what they were going to do because I had a very specific injury, right? And she gave me this clean razor and she gave me this powder. She says, when you go back to your hotel room, I want you to make incisions in your knee and put the powder on your knee, right? And at this point, I'm not really skeptical because I'm working in this field, so I do exactly what she says. And I would say my knee, the swelling went down at least 85%. I was able to make that trip, and I tried to connect to keep it going, but they didn't even have a computer in terms of this is where I would contact maybe like, how do I explain it? There wasn't enough technology for me to maintain contact with them that made sense. And I experienced this in Mozambique. I had a similar situation where I'm supposed to meet healers at a hotel. There's no cell phones at that time. So I just have to hope that somebody's going to show up because I'm in Maputo, and I'm like, okay, who am I supposed to meet? I mean, it all worked out, right? I think that's a trip when I was almost arrested as we approached a hospital, and all of a sudden I had all these healers with me because I had been sent by United Methodist Church to find out why, folks were using traditional medicine. So it's a long story, but the end of it was really interesting in that when I showed up at the hospital, I probably had like 100 people behind me, and they're saying we're going to have to arrest you for inciting this riot and stuff. The officers look into the crowd and begin to see their relatives and say, well, okay, we're going to let you go, but you can't come back, right? So I had to come back a year later with documentation from the church that I'm here to do what I'm here to do and stuff.
Legitimate. Yeah.
That's another story. But
Okay.
I'm just so it's really my trip to Africa was me trying to find my way because when I looked at holistic medicine and healing, I didn't see anyone that looked like me. I see folks that had adopted other cultures and stuff. But I said, no, okay, right. But I didn't see anyone that looked like me, and I knew that my background, it had to be rich in healers, you know, from
It had,
where it,
yeah.
it's in
It
every
is
place.
part of humanity. It's
Right,
in
it's
human
part of
history.
humanity. It's every place. It's not just a witch doctor. Come on. So,
It's not just Eastern, like Chinese people, or I don't know, some exotic
right,
Eastern thing. I don't know.
right. There used to be a saying, you don't have a Chinaman's chance. Now, I remember that. I mean, come on. It's like all these different labels and stuff. It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
So, so it is definitely a new day. And your point about how do we, for me, this is revamping the whole medical paradigm. So it starts from the inside out. Because if we can get you to a place where you believe that you truly believe that miracles are possible, you know, whether you're holding on to whatever particular religious belief, but you're also infused with the understanding that energy is flowing through you. It is not something outside of you. It's something that's up in the cloud somewhere. This is something that flows through you that you can tap into because that's essentially who you are.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is so crazy. That's essentially who you are, is this divine spiritual being having a particular experience on this plane and knowing itself through this experience, which, you know, if anyone has studied past life regression, I mean, I have, again, that's something we've used in my practice, countless stories that just document the power of that in healing. One example, I had this client, there's some good examples, but she had chronic headaches. And usually I'll use herbs, I'll use homeopathy, whatever, you know, allopathic drug as a backup, right? But I said, all right, we got to go deeper with this. So we did a past life regression with her. And basically, in a previous life, she had been pregnant, and her husband thought it was from another man and shot her in the head. Right. Now, this is not me creating the story. This is her in this kind of trance state sharing what happened. So, um, the person that I work with on this, her name is 𝗵𝗲𝗀𝗍𝗔𝗍. She's a nurse, she's a real healer, and she does this kind of work. So the idea is you change the story, right? You resolve the whole problem on that level, right? And then the problem disappears now. So needless to
Mm.
say, she didn't have migraine headaches. But I've seen that even I had a child that was a sleepwalker. And the
How do you
parents,
resolve that story of being shot in the head? You changed
mm,
what happened?
yeah, you literally you change the dynamics of what happened. Like
Okay.
even this will be more clear in the story of a child as a sleepwalker who, in the past life regression, he was a soldier that was like had crashed in the swamp. And at night, he was going out to look for his partner that was lost, that he felt was out of the plane. So to clear that up, it was like, oh, you found the partner. Yeah, you guys were rescued. You see what I'm saying?
Hmm.
So that particular story, the mother, I didn't hear from the patient after we did that, but the mother came in as a patient maybe like 15 years later and reminded me about the story and said, well, he never slept walk again after that. clear. I said, "Oh wow, isn't that cool?"
Yeah, 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 yeah. What I notice is it's like it slips in. It slips in so quickly. The healing intervention. It's not. It, it sometimes it builds like a tree growing. That sometimes it just changes, and you go, oh, now I have that piece that I needed, and now I can let
Right,
go.
right. The dial changes in terms of the frequency that
Mm-hmm.
they're connected to and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think about it, that's what we're trying to do. So I'm the last person to say we're trying to treat cancer.
Mm-hmm.
No, I do not put that out there. I don't put out there's a solution for that. What we're
Mm-hmm.
trying to do is optimize you as a divine human spirit. We're
Mm-hmm.
trying to help people within that. Within that, whatever is your destiny or that you need to experience or are here to do, that's going to happen. We're not necessarily trying to change that, but we're trying to we're trying to make it clearer for you in terms of what it is that you need to be doing in terms of your work, in terms of your healing, right? Because ultimately you still have to do that work. And
Yeah.
ultimately, all of this is just an experience.
Yeah.
It's just an experience,
So I
right?
would say that activating the natural healing forces, which is like I don't treat cancer, I activate the natural healing forces.
There we go.
And
Right.
if it's enough, then it's enough. If it's not enough, it's not enough. And or I don't even know if I like to quantify it that way. It's just there.
But shouldn't
It,
treatment start from that standpoint?
I
I
would
mean,
think
you make
so.
whatever intervention is possible, but
Mhm.
shouldn't we be functioning in a system in the quantum physics reality of the 21st century where this is where we start from?
Mhm.
This is where we start an internal investigation, an internal mental, emotional, spiritual cleansing, right? That
Yeah,
actually
I don't know
makes
about
people
that though. I
more
mean, I know that that's
available.
therapeutic, but like I treat a lot of animals. And I don't know
Okay.
that they're cleansing their consciousness when their tumors cool down, you know? And I don't know what that is, but it's real. And same thing, I mean, healing plants. I mean, you don't have to, plants have a very different consciousness than humans, and yet they
So,
respond to energy works. So do the
well,
animals.
and
Um,
it all depends on what the root is, right?
uh-huh. Yeah,
It all
yeah,
depends on poor
yeah,
animal might have been exposed to some toxin,
yeah.
not holding on to grief for 20 years or something or
Or
anger.
holding on to their beloved person's grief.
Right.
Sometimes they're doing that, but
So,
you can see
yeah.
that if you're clairvoyant and look at it. And when I look at it, it changes. And I just sort of let the organization of my patient, whether it's an animal or a person, do the sorting
Right.
of where it needs to go to heal. I don't like direct it. I used to do more anyway. The shaman work I used to do, I've supplanted by just kind of watching. It's really getting simpler and
So
simpler and simpler and simpler. So.
this is what's beautiful because
Mhm.
it's folks like yourself that I get to work with, you
Yeah,
know?
yeah, and I'm
But-
looking forward to working and having some community. I'm
Right.
super excited about it, and I love the emphasis on nature.
Mm.
Um, Different than California emphasis on nature, or I don't know. There's like a worship of nature that's anyway. I don't want to go into all that thing. But I'm a real mountain woman, and I just get nature. I don't know why, but I do.
Wow.
I just get it. And I love working with people who are at least just only one generation or less, maybe themselves, close to somebody who grew up with herbs or with, um, you know, doing little scraping things and putting powder in the knees, and like, of course that works. And it's just nice to have that not be such a barrier. And I'm thinking that this collective will attract people like that and people that can
Yeah.
help. And then there's that 100th monkey thing, which I don't know if it's a real thing or not, but it just makes sense that the more people who can experience the shifts and have them make real physical differences in their body, the easier it will be to let other people consider the possibility that open it a crack. And often that crack's all you need. You don't need to, become a
It's
hippie
like
or
it's like Rupert Sheldrake's work on
yes,
morphogenic fields and how
yes,
species, when one
yeah,
species learns, in another part of the world, the other species, same species in another part of the world picks it up that much
yeah,
quicker.
yeah. And I would say for my viewers, if you've watched this long, you're sort of you're already on board with all this. And I would say that your shift in consciousness does matter. That it's not just about your little boo-boos, your little ailments and your small biography, that you are a homeopathic giant. Anyway,
Mm.
so I wanted to leave my viewers with that, but what would you like to maybe sum up something to give our listeners of where to go from now? Maybe give the website that can go into
Sure.
this and all that.
Well, for the work that the Multidimensional Healing Collective does, it's multidhc.com, multidhc.com. And if you're interested in my work, my practice is in both California and North Carolina. It's Kokayi Health, Kokayi health.com. And what I say, I have a radio program that airs at 11 a.m. WBAI.org, 99.5 FM. What I always end my programs with is that consciousness wants to express itself as you, through you. You are the one that you've been waiting for. Blessings. And it's going to keep it going.
All right. Okay. Thank you.